Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over two of the absolute worst disasters in history, and the final story is a disaster unlike any other you've probably heard of in a spot that is also unlike any other on Earth. You'll see what I mean. And as always, viewer discretion is advised. Mount Ruapehu, located in the very center of New Zealand's North Island, is about as beautiful a view as you're likely to find anywhere. This is even more impressive considering the seemingly endless natural beauty of New Zealand, but the mountain is deceptive. Mount Ruapehu is both the tallest mountain on the North Island and the country's most active volcano. About every 50 years since it began to be recorded, volcanic activity increases, which can amount to as little as a few tremors over a few days to as much as a cataclysmic months-long event. In early 1945, Mount Ruapehu began ramping up for one of these eruptions as activity slowly built in March. This caused several lava domes to form on its surface. This is when lava comes up bubbling through vents and forms a large dome. Between the three peaks that form the mountain also sits a large crater filled with water known fittingly as Crater Lake. By July of that year, Crater Lake water levels had fluctuated significantly and at one point drained almost completely of water to its 1,000 feet or over 300-meter depth. At several points, massive steam eruptions also occurred that were visible from 100 kilometers away from the interaction between the water and the hot volcanic material. These eruptions continued for most of the year, and by December, volcanic activity started to wane. Soon after, Crater Lake began to return to its normal level as rain and snowmelt came in, and with some of the drainage points being plugged up with volcanic material. These blockages are what's known as a tephra dam, and tephra is just another word for all the fragments of rock that were ejected by the eruptions. By 1953, Crater Lake was actually sitting 26 feet or 8 meters higher than it was prior to the 1945 eruption thanks to the buildup of tephra around the rim. Unfortunately, what can happen is that these dams, which form sort of at random, are not completely stable. This instability created a precarious situation that went largely unnoticed. At around 8 p.m. on Christmas Eve 1953 that year, the volcanic material holding back Crater Lake finally gave way. In an instant, 90 million gallons or 340,000 cubic meters of water began rushing into the river below. This river runs down the mountain to the east before taking a 90-degree turn southward, followed by a gradual westward curve that takes it right through the tiny community of Tangaway. Known as a lahar, this torrent of mud, debris, and volcanic material roared down the mountainside until 10:21 p.m. This is when the sound was interrupted by a piercing squeal. 5 hours earlier, at just before 3 o'clock, the train station in Wellington, New Zealand was buzzing with activity. Travelers bustled around the platform, searching for their assigned carriages, while a team of station employees loaded up the cargo areas with neatly wrapped presents and stacks of luggage. It was one of the last opportunities for those in Wellington to reach Auckland by Christmas morning, and the train's passenger cars were sold to capacity. As time ticked closer to its scheduled departure, the KA 949 steam locomotive let off white plumes before the whistle sounded and shouts of "all aboard" echoed through the platform. The last of the passengers hopped on as the train got off to a creeping start, while those already in their seats waved out the windows to their friends and loved ones. Moments later, the 11-carriage train disappeared on the tracks on its way to Auckland. The weather had been mostly agreeable across the entire route in the days leading up to Christmas Eve, and it didn't appear like that would change at all. The route would have several stops along the way, and close to the midway point, the train was scheduled to pass right by Mount Ruapehu via the bridge over the river in Tangaway. At 7 o'clock that evening, a goods train passed through the community without issue, but by a little after 8, Tangaway was in the midst of the destructive lahar. Despite the waters pounding the train bridge, it held up without wavering, but sometime between 10:10 and 10:15, a tsunami wave of water, ice, mud, and rocks 20 feet or 6 meters high slammed into the concrete pylons. This collision caused a single concrete pylon to break away after it had been weakened in a previous lahar. Minutes later, the train carrying 285 people in 9 passenger cars could be seen approaching Tangaway, completely unaware of the danger ahead. While driving through the community, a man named Cyril noticed the road in front of him had disappeared and had been replaced by rushing water, forcing him to stop. Suddenly, a light caught his attention, and when he turned, he saw the headlamp of a train that was running full speed toward the damaged bridge. Grabbing his flashlight, Cyril ran out of his car and ran toward the tracks. Once he got near them, he flicked the light on and began waving it wildly, hoping to get the attention of the train driver. The subsequent screech of the train wheels seemed to indicate that the driver noticed the light, but even short passenger trains require a fair amount of distance to come to a complete stop. By the time the driver noticed Cyril, it was already far too late. At 10:21 p.m., the locomotive crossed the threshold and fell through the weakened gap in the bridge into the rushing water below. 4 passenger carriages were then pulled over the edge by the engine car, and they all disconnected from one another in midair, flying off in different directions. The 5th passenger carriage, Car Z, then came to a stop with almost half of it teetering over the edge of the gap. Cyril and a railway guard named William then yelled to the stunned and terrified passengers inside, but they had barely gotten a few words out when the weight of the car sent it plummeting off the edge. The carriage then slammed into the water below, and the violent current carried it to a few hundred feet before it caught a river embankment and came to a stop. Now on its side, the car was partially submerged in the rushing water. The 2 men then hurried down the embankment and climbed onto the side of the carriage. And simultaneously, one of the passengers, a man named John, squeezed out of a window, and all 3 of them began breaking the glass and pulling passengers to safety. Almost identical to the situation Cyril found himself in, another man named Arthur and his wife also saw the train plunge into the river. As Arthur ran down the riverbank to help, his wife rushed off to contact emergency services, although a police constable had heard the collision and arrived at the scene shortly afterward. Until more officials showed up, the constable directed the frantic rescue effort, as many of those who were even able to escape the passenger cars were swept down the river. Some managed to make it to the safety of riverbanks eventually, but others were not so lucky. Back on the 5th passenger car that was on its side, those pulled out by Cyril, William, and John were then trapped on the upright side of the car with water rushing around on all sides. For 45 minutes, the scene was pure and total chaos. Meanwhile, in complete contrast, passengers inside the 4 carriages that remained in the tracks above were calm and uncertain of what was happening. They believed they were just in some kind of unexpected delay or that they had reached a station, and many of them were completely oblivious to the tragedy unfolding around them. Then, almost as quickly as the lahar started, it dissipated around 11 o'clock and a more concerted rescue effort began. Conditions were still extremely dangerous though. The water was filled with mud and tephra, and from the locomotive, oil was spilled into the river. Some survivors were completely covered in it, and others even died from asphyxia from the mud and oil. And so, as the roar of the water faded, it was replaced by the survivors and rescuers alike. At the time as well, New Zealand didn't have any kind of national rescue organization, so those who responded to the scene were a mix of New Zealand Forestry Service, the Ministry of Works, police, military, farmers, and other locals. A nearby military camp also brought in as many able-bodied men as they could and set up a shelter for survivors. When the sun rose on Christmas Day, the scale of the disaster was finally realized. Parts of mangled train carriages and people were everywhere. The task of recovering them then got underway as families around the country gathered to celebrate Christmas morning with no knowledge of the disaster. At the time as well, New Zealand newspapers didn't print on Christmas Day, so word was slow to get around until a national broadcast interrupted regularly scheduled radio programming. The Prime Minister then had the grim duty to inform New Zealand about what had happened overnight in Tongawe. With almost 300 people aboard the train at the time of the accident, out of a population of just 2 million people, almost every citizen either knew someone on the train or someone indirectly impacted by the tragedy. As people were removed from the wreckage, the next task was to begin identifying them, which can be a difficult task in the best of conditions. With so much mud and oil in the water, almost everyone was completely coated in it. And as if that didn't make identification difficult enough, many of them had been mangled by debris, leaving some in pieces. Passengers were also from all around, meaning they had no medical or dental records that were available locally to assist in the identification process. Further compounding the problem was that there wasn't much near Tongawe, meaning that there was a distinct shortage of refrigeration facilities to store them until they were claimed. This caused the process to be rushed, leading to misidentifications. In fact, a few days after the disaster, police had so many unidentified that the chief inspector set up a viewing for family members. Prior to entering the makeshift mortuary, the inspector gave a short talk to prepare everyone for what they were about to see. When he was finished, the doors of the mortuary opened to the sight of partially open coffins in a line. Then, slowly, family members walked alongside the coffins to identify their family members. In all, 151 of the 285 people aboard the train didn't make it, making it by far New Zealand's worst railway disaster and the 8th worst in the world at the time. Among those who didn't make it, 21 people went initially unidentified and 20 more were simply never found. Those who weren't recovered were believed to have been washed out to the sea some 75 miles or 120 kilometers away. Adding to the tragedy, the makeup of the trains revealed a significant disparity between social classes. The way passenger trains were set up, second-class carriages were situated closest to the locomotive. This was because, for a first-class fare, passengers could avoid the noise, coal dust, fumes, and smoke from the engine car. As a result of this also put second-class passengers more at risk in the case of a head-on collision or derailment, and the disaster at Tongaway was no different. Behind the locomotive were 4 second-class carriages, and behind those were 5 first-class carriages. All 4 of those second-class carriages crashed into the water that night, and only one of the first-class cars ended up in the river. The first-class car that did tumble through the gap in the bridge was Car Z, the one that teetered on the edge for a moment that Cyril, William, and John rescued passengers from. Of the 22 people aboard Car Z, the 3 men managed to save 21 and bring them to safety. In contrast, of 170 second-class passengers, 142 didn't make it, accounting for 94% of the total casualties, while only 1 first-class passenger didn't make it. With all of that said, a later investigation into the disaster itself found that there was no fault on the part of the driver or the rail company. It was just a horrific accident. An indirect factor, however, was an earlier lahar. In 1925, a much less powerful surge came down from the mountain, battering the concrete bridge pillars with volcanic debris and weakening the supports. Because this occurred underwater, however, it went undiscovered. This disaster remains one of the worst in New Zealand's history, and in the end, Cyril, William, John, and Arthur all received medals of recognition for their bravery from Queen Elizabeth II. Newfoundland and Labrador is one of Canada's 10 provinces, and it's located on the extreme eastern coast of North America. Within the province, the town of Pouch Cove sits almost at the easternmost point of the continent, about 17 miles north of Newfoundland's capital city of St. John's. It's so far east, in fact, that the town proclaims itself as the first to see the sun. Now, despite its proximity to St. John's, Pouch Cove has a relatively remote feel to it. Even today, only about 2,000 people call it home, but far fewer were living in the area in the late 1800s. But despite its small size, calling it picturesque would be drastically underselling the natural beauty of the oceanfront town. The coastline that Pouch Cove occupies is about as gorgeous as it gets, with tall, rocky cliffs that rise from a boulder-strewn shore. Massive waves also crash into the cove, providing much of the quaint town with a near-constant sound of the roaring sea. Initially a British territory until 1949, Newfoundland was and still is significant to seafaring industries. Because of this, it was naturally an ideal place for shipbuilding, and in 1869, the Brits completed a schooner that was dubbed the Water Witch. Compared to other ships at the time, there was nothing really different or special about the vessel and its single-deck, double-mast configuration. The Water Witch was 69 feet or 21 meters long and about 19 feet or 6 meters at its widest, so it wasn't built to be the biggest or fastest ship of the period. It also wasn't constructed to cross oceans. Instead, it was intended to be a vessel that hugged the coastline and transported cargo and people relatively short distances, which was a purpose that it served well. In the early evening of November 29, 1875, the Water Witch left St. John's with 25 people aboard, including 50-year-old Captain Samuel Spracklin. The rest of the ship's occupants were either members of the crew or men and women carrying provisions back home for the winter. The ship was bound for the tiny town of Cupids on Conception Bay, which was its home port. This routine 40-mile trip would take the ship north from St. John's, then around Cape St. Francis on the northeast side of the Avalon Peninsula, then southwest into Cupids. When the Water Witch departed St. John's, the weather was similar to what Pouch Cove was experiencing early in the evening, which were strong winds and snowfall. These weren't optimal sailing conditions, but they weren't impossible either, at least not until later that night. As the weather gained in intensity, though, visibility diminished to almost nothing, and the captain and crew of the Water Witch were left navigating the ship based on nothing more than the sounds of the waves, travel time, and the sense of the sea they developed over years of sailing. As evening turned to night, the captain used those factors to pinpoint on his map where the ship most likely was. When he marked their probable location, he saw that they were clear of Cape St. Francis and the ship could begin its turn west, which he ordered. This was a decision that would be met with disastrous consequences. Around 9:30 p.m., the lookout in the crow's nest shouted a frantic warning about there being rocks straight ahead, but Samuel thought that couldn't be possible. He then looked toward the bow of the ship, and while there was still a bit of distance between the Water Witch and the rocky coast, he immediately knew it was too late to do anything about it. As it turned out, they weren't in fact clear of Cape St. Francis. The strong southwesterly wind had slowed the Water Witch's northern progress, so instead, the Water Witch was headed directly into an area known as Horrid Gulch. This ominous name is fitting too. Horde Gulch is little more than a narrow slit in the coastline where cliffs hundreds of feet tall concentrate the power of the waves between their walls before they crash into the gulch's furthest inland wall. There's no true sense of shore in the gulch either because the water is very deep right up to the edge of the coastline. So for example, if you stand at sea level and drop a stone into the water, the stone will fall a great distance before hitting the bottom because there's no gradual slope or shallow shore. Instead, the waves have carved out a deep, turbulent area beneath the surface, making the water depth significant even near the shore. This churning action of the waves also prevents anything that falls into the water from easily escaping. Standing at the bow, it was clear to Samuel that the impact with the far rock wall was going to be worse than any boat collision he'd ever experienced before. As the water witch rapidly approached the cliff face, Samuel, his son, and 2 other crewmen positioned themselves on the bow's rail. A moment later, they leapt for the boulders that jutted out of the gulch's waters, making it just before the water witch slammed into the wall, which immediately destroyed much of the bow. In fact, it hit so hard that the ship rebounded backwards some distance, and after seeing their captain and fellow crewmen make their desperate leap for the rocks, 9 other crew members jumped before the second impact and managed to avoid being smashed in the collision. This second collision was so violent and so damaging to the ship that just seconds later, the water witch slipped under the waters. It then sank to the deep bottom of the gulch with 8 remaining men and 4 women still aboard. With the ship resting at the bottom of the ocean, 13 survivors clung to the rocks around Horde Gulch. Samuel and those who jumped with him ended up on one side, while 9 others who leapt before the second impact were in a much more dangerous position across the gulch. They barely had enough room for each of them to stand on the wet, sloping ledge that sat just a few feet above the churning water below. And horrifyingly, above them was a sheer cliff face 600 feet or 183 meters high. Samuel and the others, meanwhile, were in a bit of a better spot. Behind them was a hill with a steep grade of about 40 degrees in the form of a trench that ran the same 600 feet to the very top. If they were going to survive, the captain and those with him would have to pull their way up the long, steep, slippery slope that was covered in overgrowth and brush, and then try to find help in an area where they had no idea where they were. And if that wasn't enough of a challenge, they'd have to do this on a pitch-black night in blinding snow and winds while soaking wet in freezing temperatures and without any ropes or anything else. This was a next to impossible task, but they didn't have much of a choice either. They could either stay on the rocks and get battered by the waves and either drown or succumb to hypothermia, or they could die trying to save themselves. So, Samuel, his son, and the 2 crewmen latched onto the rocks of the trench and started their dangerous climb after shouting to the others that they were going to get help. By some miracle, sometime later, they all reached the top and were exhausted and in disbelief that they were still alive. They then took a moment to catch their breath and check each other over to make sure that they were each okay. And incredibly, somehow they defied the odds without suffering more than a few scratches and bruises. Once that was over with, they had to confront the next problem. As they looked around in the limited visibility they had to work with, there was nothing at the top of the cliff. No houses, no roads, and no signs of civilization. All they could really do was choose a random direction, and the wrong choice could lead them nowhere, which would be a death sentence for the men they left behind and probably for themselves too. Then, suddenly, they heard the faint sound of a dog barking to the south, and that was enough to help them make the decision on which way to go. Still soaked to the bone and with the freezing wind at their backs, they trudged through the snow with nothing more than a few dog barks to guide them. Because the visibility was so poor, the men could be walking by houses occupied by people and never know it, so in hopes that someone would hear them, they shouted as they walked. Around 1:30 a.m., one of them spotted a light through the snow, and as they drew closer to it, a small cottage came into view. In it, a man named William Langmead was sleeping soundly until some strange sounds began to wake him up. As he sat completely still in bed and listened closely, he could swear he heard voices. They were distant and barely perceptible to the point where William questioned whether or not his mind was playing tricks on him. However, the voices grew louder, and it became clear that it was neither his imagination nor the wind. In fact, it sounded like 4 separate voices, each of them desperately screaming for help. William then hastily rushed to the front door to see what all the shouting was about. When he threw the door open, he never expected that he'd find himself in the middle of one of the most harrowing disasters in Newfoundland history. Just the sight of Samuel and the others was enough to communicate to William that these men had been through some kind of horrible ordeal. This was then confirmed to him as Samuel explained their predicament through a shaky, shivering voice. William then hurried them inside the house to warm them up, and the 4 men huddled near the fire. William then grabbed some brandy, believing it would warm them, and once he was certain they were settled, he told them he was going to go round up some help. Throwing on a coat and hat, he entered the storm and went door to door, gathering as many able-bodied Pouch Cove men as he could. By 3 o'clock that morning, half the town was awake as citizens sprang into action upon hearing the news of the shipwreck and the trapped survivors. Many of them grabbed any equipment that could come in handy during the rescue before running out of their houses and gathering near William's house. Finally, armed with lanterns, ropes, and brandy, the team began to walk to the north. Because Samuel and the 3 other men were in such bad shape, they remained in William's home, leaving the rescuers only vague directions that could lead them to the location of the shipwreck. By their description, however, locals could tell they were referring to Horde Gulch, and as they neared the cliffs that overlooked the area, the screams and cries of the men below could be heard. When the survivors heard the rescuers shout in return, they begged for a rope or anything else that could get them off the precipice. This response then allowed the rescuers to pinpoint their location, since the dark night and snow obscured any view of them. However, even with ropes and lanterns, the rescue attempt would be far more dangerous than the climb Samuel and the other crewmen undertook. Reaching the survivors meant somehow descending 600 feet of near vertical cliff face. As the volunteers huddled to formulate a plan, there was only one conclusion any of them could come to. Someone would have to be brave enough to dangle from the end of a rope all the way down to the ledge where the survivors clung to life. The men then looked at one another, and with little hesitation, a fisherman named Alfred Moore stepped forward and tied the end of a thick rope around his waist before walking to the edge of the cliff. The other end of the rope was affixed to a nearby tree, and between the tree and Alfred, each of the remaining volunteers grabbed hold of the rope, putting every bit of manpower into lowering him safely. Alfred then stepped back tentatively over the edge, but as soon as he let go of the cliff, the wind swung the rope and almost immediately put him into an out-of-control spin. There would end up being 3 different attempts to lower him, and all 3 ended with Alfred needing to be pulled back up to the top of the cliff. Finally, on the 4th try, he was able to maintain just enough control to reach the end of the rope's slack, which put him on a ledge of his own. The problem was that he was still 30 feet or 9 meters above the 9 shipwreck survivors. By then, the morning sun was also starting to rise, and Alfred could finally lay eyes on them, and he could hardly believe the precariousness of the ledges they were on, or his own for that matter. Still, he had no choice but to try to rescue them. Alfred then dropped a hand rope down to the men, and using that rope as a guide, he dropped the end of a stronger rope that would be used for pulling each of them up. Once that reached them, the first man tied it around his waist. As this was happening, some of the volunteers used the rope that Alfred was attached to as a guide to strategically position themselves on multiple ledges of the cliff at varying heights. Most of the men remained at the top to better concentrate their strength on more solid ground, while those on the ledges would help pull survivors up as well as relay communication between the men at the top and Alfred at the bottom. Once the rope was secured around the first survivor and he was ready, Alfred signaled to the men above and they started to pull. It felt like it took forever, but hand over hand, the rescuers pulled until the first man was safely at the top of the cliff. Almost immediately, he was met with a shot of brandy before being guided to Pouch Cove, where he could be attended to by those who remained behind. This was a process that took hours and cost the volunteers every single bit of energy they had, but 7 more survivors were saved in the same manner as the first. That left just one more, a frightened and soaked boy who was on a separate ledge. It was clear that he would die if he wasn't saved as quickly as possible, but his position put his rescue in doubt. The volunteers wondered if they could even get Alfred to him, but they at least had to try. They then repositioned Alfred, and he flung the end of a rope in the boy's direction. The boy managed to catch it, and using what little energy he had left, he tied it around his waist. When he was finally lifted off the rocky ledge, he had been stuck there, clinging to life for 10.5 hours. He was so exhausted that some of the men had to carry him all the way back to Pouch Cove, where each house in the entire town had opened its doors to these shipwrecked men. As the storm settled and the survivors were cared for back in Pouch Cove, more volunteers set about retrieving the bodies of those who perished when the water which impacted the rocks of Horde Gulch. Tragically, 6 of the 12 who died were members of Samuel's family. In Pouch Cove, coffins awaited the dead as each body was carefully and reverently placed inside before being shipped back to loved ones for proper burial. Most of those they pulled from the wreck were in surprisingly good shape, but one of the younger men was found with his legs completely gone, demonstrating just how forcefully the ship hit the rocks of Horde Gulch. In the aftermath, Alfred's selfless actions that day earned him the nickname Brave Alfred Moores, which stuck with him for the rest of his life. His fearlessness also earned him a silver medal from the British Royal Humane Society. The 5 other men who went part of the way down the cliff to assist each received bronze medals as well, and all of the survivors of the shipwreck made full recoveries. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.